We want to move into chapter two, which is yesterday and today, where we trace how we actually got to where we are. And looking at the 20th century, a century of change, the first half.
So, starting at the top of the 20th century, in the first half, gender roles were rigid. Men dominated the workforce, and the stay-at-home wife was the norm, especially in white middle-class America. About 4 out of every 5 women stayed home, and while 4 out of every 5 men worked.
So this was reinforced by a patriarchal social system and the Industrial Revolution. And labor force participation stayed fairly stable.
Exactly. And then World War I hit. So within 1914 to 1918, participation shifted only slightly. And when the men came home, they were given hiring preference. Women who had taken up those jobs during the war had largely lost them.
That's right. So 1920 brought the 19th Amendment and the women's right to vote, which was a major step forward for equality. However, it didn't translate into much actual change in women's economic status. Okay.
And then the Great Depression hit, and unemployment rose sharply. So male breadwinners who lost their jobs also lost a sense of identity tied to that role. And then there was the growing resentment towards working women.
That's right. World War II reversed the trend. There was a huge demand for female labor. I just watched a documentary that said women basically fueled the entire labor force that kept World War II in business. So at this time, unlike World War I, there wasn't as dramatic a reversal once the war ended. More women stayed in the workforce.
So now here's where we have a turning point, and that's easy to underestimate: the birth control pill. It let women pursue education without the same fear of unplanned pregnancy derailing those plans.
That's right. It can't be overestimated how influential having uh, planned pregnancy for this second half of the 20th century. It helped women prepare for managerial and professional careers, not just to enter the workforce temporarily, but stay there if they wanted to. So labor force participation for women grew about 31 to 60%, which was the highest jump among non-Hispanic white women, while participation for men actually dropped from 80 to 75%.
And so when we think about this and when we think about what happens within the educational attainment, we think of as education access opened up, we saw a shift in what was driving women into the workforce, which was a desire for a higher standard of living, rising consumerism, and wanting to send their own kids to college.
That's right. And we know the price of college hasn't stayed low, as all of you can attest. But notice how it was still often framed. Women helping their spouses or working temporarily to support the household until they started a family. It was not necessarily framed as women having careers in their own right yet. And you'll see some of these stats on our charts here, so you can take a look at those.
Absolutely. And then, so jumping to more current data, as of March 2025, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that women's labor force participation holds steady at 57.5%.
So a lot of post-COVID rebound correlates with women's rising degree attainment rates among women with young children compared to women without kids or with older kids who have gone back to school.
Yeah. And that makes sense. And even when women are in management, they're connected or concentrated in lower level roles with less decision-making authority, which keeps their overall economic status below men's in nearly every country.
Yeah, that's the unfortunate truth. And as employment and education rose together, so did the number of white collar jobs together. And for the first time, a lot of women could actually picture themselves in these jobs. You can see the rise of the white collar jobs.
So now here we have the National Organization for Women, also called NOW. And this was the first major feminist organization since the original suffrage movement. And so part of the broader women's liberation movement that happened in the late 60s and the early 70s. And this was all inspired by the civil rights movement.
Now push back on discrimination in employment, education, the legal system, and advocated for changes like fairer hiring and promotion practices, adding women's studies to curricula, and reducing gender stereotypes overall.
And so this era also saw real public backlash, however, and professional women expressing frustration with the barriers they still faced, and even had a real push for legislative and economic reform.
So, some major legislative changes on this slide. This slide covers some of the major legal wins of the era. Equal employment opportunity laws started in the late 1960s, restricting discrimination in hiring practices. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was later strengthened by the Lilly Ledbetter Act in 2009, signed into law by Obama, prohibits discrimination based on sex, race, color, religion, national origin, pregnancy, and sexual harassment. And you will be looking more at Lilly Ledbetter in your discussion board activities and her situation and what happened with her.
And then to add to that, we have the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which made it illegal to pay one sex less than the other for equivalent work.
Yeah,
And then we have Title IX in 1972, which banned sex discrimination in any educational institution receiving federal funding. And this is also exactly why we saw such a boom and increase in women's college athletics.
that's right. But there was still real resistance as well, as we tend to see when we have any forward momentum and progress. We always tend to see a backlash. Some called it the great experiment that failed because men who felt threatened were often committed to traditional family roles, worried about their own worried about their own job security, and viewed affirmative action as reverse discrimination. And perhaps we see this happening today in some areas where there's a similar backlash happening right now, with movement towards traditional family values, women leaving the work, pressure for women to leave the workforce, have more children, uh, and reconnect with more traditional family roles and gender roles. We see a lot of this happening in more far right circles, and so things tend to we tend to see backlashes happen whenever there's big periods of change, big periods of progressive changes. Then we tend to see that same kind of backlash that we saw in the second half of the 20th century. We're seeing again.
And then so now we'll look at some high profile public examples. And so one is Lisa Olson, who is a sports journalist who was harassed while interviewing the New England Patriots, the team owner who infamously insulted her rather than addressing the harassment.
Yeah, that was an ugly situation. Another is the treatment of naval officers harassed and intimidated, female naval officers harassed and intimidated by fellow officers after reporting misconduct.
And then there's Clarence Thomas Anita Hill hearings, which brought the intersection of race and gender into national focus during his Supreme Court confirmation. This has become a defining case study in how difficult these situations are to adjudicate publicly.
That's right. If some of you have never seen the Clarence Thomas confirmation, where Joe Biden, a very young Joe Biden, actually oversaw his Supreme Court confirmation hearings, it was really, really contentious. And the Anita Hill testimony about being sexually harassed by Clarence Thomas, and he was confirmed anyway, and she was discredited. It's very upsetting because she testified as to what happened when she was a clerk under him, and you may want to check it out because it's kind of similar to the things that we've seen since then with people coming forward about sexual misconduct, all the way to the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings. And women who have come forward about sexual misconduct tend to be discounted when they come forward about very powerful men and sexual misconduct, and they're confirmed anyway. And this is something that even today we see happening. And obviously, Donald Trump has also been found to be guilty of sexual misconduct. So these are things we may ask ourselves as to why this doesn't bother a majority of people more, um, in terms of electing our leaders, and why we don't hold leaders to higher standards for this kind of conduct. Just something to think about. So let's look at workplace romance. It raises a different set of questions as terms of where the line is, and who gets to be held to what standard as we think about this question.
Yeah, absolutely. And so then we think of, or at least I think of, the Clinton Lewinsky example, which gets referenced a lot here. And so the core
Mhm.
debate is whether workplace flirtation reinforces the stereotype of women as sex objects and undermines merit-based advancement. It also raises the risk of sexual harassment claims.
Absolutely. There's a real double standard in who's allowed to benefit from workplace flirtation without professional consequences and who isn't. And that goes back to asking ourselves, what we hold as a standard for behavior, uh, and who, again, who benefits, who's held accountable, who comes out on top of these situations. and what we're willing to accept from our leaders.
So now let's look at a snapshot of where things stand for different racial and ethnic groups as we change focus. From the late 20th century into the early 21st century, change has actually slowed down quite a bit.
So men's labor force participation rate has dropped from that 75% we talked about later in 2000 to 72% today. And women's participation moved from 58% in 1990 up to 60% in 2000. It's settled at about 59% today. So take a look at these charts. There's some in your textbook as well.
And then so when we think about that and to add, where occupations where men and women aren't evenly distributed, and these are called sex segregated. And that segregation is still very high across all countries, though it has dropped some since the 1970s as women have entered more male-dominated fields.
That's right. And the categories break down kind of like this, where male intensive occupations are about 33% or less female, while female intensive occupations are about 67, almost 66 to 67% or more female. And sex neutral occupations fall somewhere in between.
And so when we think about the day-to-day experience at work, it tends to differ quite a bit depending on which of those three categories your occupation falls into.
So take a look at these charts and you can look at them in a bit more detail on your own. We've got some more for you here, looking at the diversity and complexity of women's roles in the workforce. Uh, because this slide's a little bit more visual, it's really about kind of the range and complexity of those roles women hold across the workforce today. And you can kind of look at this again. This data is not in your textbook. It's a chart that I found that I thought you might be interested in. So please feel free as you look at the slides to take a peek at this.
And then, so as we move on, we will look at the wage gap, which has narrowed since the 1970s from around 60 cents on the dollar up to about 80 cents, and largely as more women entered male intensive occupations.
Yeah, but that remaining 20% gap is still considerable. Again, I'm being a bit of a pessimist. You're going to have to forgive me, but it persists across all occupations, racial and ethnic group, and national cultures. So interestingly, the higher somebody's education level, the lower the female to male pay ratio tends to be. The gap doesn't close the more credentials you have. It actually widens. So that leads me to be a little bit more pessimistic. Despite my desire to be optimistic, it just kind of leaves you thinking, why?
Most definitely. And so then when I think of this slide here, which is as of 2024, the smallest average wage gap is for Caucasian women, and they earn roughly 16 to 70% less than white men. And so when we take a look at how this compares across other groups on the slide, it goes back to your whole pessimist mentality where we're trying to be realistic about this, although we want to be optimistic.
That's right. We really do. We try to be. So hold us accountable. You share your thoughts. We want to hear from you on the discussion boards. This is a collaborative class. This is a class we're going to tackle together. So share your thoughts with us. We look forward to seeing them on the discussion board. But there is a cost of being female, and our men in the class, we value you. We're so glad you're here. We want to hear your experiences. You make the class so rich and diverse in opinions. We know you have journeys to leadership that are interesting, and your experiences are just as important to us. So your gendered expression and your gendered lived experiences are going to be ones that we learn from. We learn from you. You learn from us. That's what this class is all about. But there is a cost of being female. And so this slide gets at something a little subtler. In how we value different kinds of work. Some occupations, as we've seen, are coded, if you will, as being more appropriate for women and others more appropriate for men. Uh, and the ones that are coded for women are just simply paid less. And that's how it's been for a long time.
Well, and that's really unfortunate because it's not that men just happen to earn more, it's that work performed by men, even equivalent work, tends to be valued more highly than the same work performed by women. And so that's the cost of being female that this chapter is naming and that we're describing here.
Absolutely. It's so true. So we're going to close down our first lecture. Uh, we want to we're going to let our optimists out, Shanna. We're letting our optimists out here at the end. We want to create this future together. Um, all of us. We want to close chapters 1 and 2 together on this note, our positive note, and our future leaders, are, especially those are, since we're talking about the cost of being daughters, our mothers, grandmothers, partners, friends, coworkers, and neighbors.
Absolutely. And so on the optimistic positive note, creating a future with real gender equality in leadership isn't an issue that belongs just to one gender. It's something we all shape together and it intersects with other forms of marginalization, and we'll also be making space for that in this course. But for now, we have where creating a future with real gender equality starts with all of us.
That's right. So that's chapters 1 and 2, and it's a great place to pause before we will begin chapter 3. Thank you.
Thank you.